If that shrew gets a share, I'll drag this family through court until the day I die, my son shouted across the attorney's office while pointing straight at me. And for a moment, nobody in the room moved. The ticking grandfather clock near the bookshelf suddenly sounded louder than his voice. Even Harold Bennett, my husband's attorney for nearly 30 years, lowered the papers in his hands and stared at Daniel in silence. I sat perfectly still at the far end of the mahogany conference table, my hands folded neatly in my lap beside my late husband's silver watch. Outside the tall windows, cold November rain streaked down the glass in long, crooked lines, turning downtown Hartford gray and distant. My daughter-in-law Vanessa slowly crossed one elegant leg over the other and adjusted the sleeve of her cream-colored coat without saying a word. That was the part one remember most clearly. Not Daniel shouting. Not the shocked expressions from my husband's cousins sitting near the door. It was Vanessa's expression. Calm, patient, almost satisfied. As if this moment had been rehearsed in private long before I walked into that office. Harold cleared his throat softly. Daniel, he said carefully, I strongly suggest you lower your voice. Why? My son snapped. Everyone here already knows she manipulated my father for years. The words settled over the room like ash. I felt my wedding ring press cold against my finger as I turned it once without thinking. 43 years of marriage. 43 years beside Edward Whitmore. And now our son was speaking about me as if I were some stranger who had wandered in from the street looking for money. Nobody defended me. Not immediately. Daniel stood near the end of the table with his jacket half unbuttoned, his face red with anger I barely recognized anymore. At 42, he looked so much like his father around the eyes that sometimes it startled me. But Edward had never spoken cruelly. Even in anger, my husband had carried restraint like second nature. Daniel had lost that years ago, though I had tried not to notice it happening. Tried not to see how Vanessa quietly sharpened every bitterness inside him. Dad promised me. That company, Daniel continued. He promised me the lake house too. If she thinks she's walking away with half after everything. Daniel, Vanessa interrupted softly, placing a manicured hand against his arm. Please, not here. But there was no real concern in her voice. Only performance. Harold removed his glasses slowly and placed them on top of the stack of documents in front of him. His tired eyes moved toward me for only a second before returning to my son. There is more to your father's estate plan than you realize, he said quietly. Daniel gave a short, bitter laugh. Then let's hear it. The rain outside grew heavier. Somewhere down the hallway, an elevator bell chimed faintly. Harold hesitated for a long moment before reaching beneath the table toward his leather briefcase. His hand disappeared inside. Then he pulled out a sealed ivory envelope with my husband's handwriting across the front. My breathing stopped the instant I saw it. Edward Whitmore, written in dark blue ink. Harold placed the envelope carefully on the table between us. In that case, he said softly, perhaps we should open the second envelope. Nobody spoke after Harold placed the envelope on the table. I could hear the faint hum of the building heater somewhere behind the walls and the soft tapping of rain against the windows overlooking Main Street. Daniel stared at the envelope with narrowed eyes while Vanessa slowly leaned back in her chair, studying Harold carefully now instead of pretending disinterest. My husband's handwriting sat there between us like a ghost refusing to leave the room. I had not seen that shade of blue ink since Edward died 3 weeks earlier. He always used the same fountain pen for important things. Birthday cards, Christmas checks for the grandchildren, anniversary letters he slipped into my purse every October. My throat tightened unexpectedly, but I swallowed the feeling down before anyone noticed. Harold rested one hand over the envelope, but did not open it yet. Before we continue, he said quietly, there are details your father wanted documented in the proper order. Daniel gave a sharp, impatient exhale. I already know what my father wanted. Harold looked at him for a long moment. No, he replied calmly. I do not believe you did. Vanessa shifted beside him then, just slightly, but I noticed it. She had perfected the art of appearing composed while calculating every movement around her. The first time I met her, nearly 15 years ago, I remembered thinking how polished she seemed for someone only 23 years old. Perfect posture, perfect smile, perfect manners. Edward noticed it too. She is always performing, he told me once after a family dinner years ago. At the time, I thought he was being unfair. Now I wondered if he had simply seen things sooner than I had. My eyes drifted toward the rain-covered windows as Harold continued sorting through papers. 3 days earlier, I had been sitting alone in the breakfast room of the house Edward and I spent most of our marriage restoring together. The November mornings felt colder without him there. The coffee always tasted bitter now no matter how much cream I added. I still woke up at 6 because that was the hour Edward always came downstairs in his robe carrying the newspaper tucked beneath his arm. For 43 years, the sound of his footsteps had marked the beginning of my mornings. Silence had replaced all of it. I remember sitting at the table staring at his empty chair while steam rose from my untouched coffee. The maple trees behind the backyard had already lost nearly all their leaves. The swimming pool had been covered for winter 2 weeks before Edward's funeral. Everything looked abandoned. Even the house itself seemed to understand he was gone. That morning, Vanessa walked into the kitchen wearing workout clothes and carrying her phone against her ear. She stopped when she saw me sitting there. "I will call you back," she said quickly before ending the call. Her smile appeared a second later, like someone flipping on a light switch. "You are up early," she said. "I could say the same thing," I answered softly. She opened the refrigerator and removed a bottle of green juice. "Daniel and I are meeting a realtor later," she said casually while checking messages on her phone. "Just exploring options." My fingers tightened slightly around the coffee mug. "Options for what?" She shrugged without looking at me. "Well, this house is a lot for one person." "One person? Not family. Not us. One person." I remember staring down into my coffee after she left the room. The surface had already gone cold. Upstairs, I heard Daniel's footsteps crossing the hallway toward the master bedroom Edward and I once shared. And for the first time since burying my husband, I realized they were no longer waiting for me to grieve. They were waiting for me to disappear. Back in Harold's office, the silence around the table had turned heavy enough to feel physical. Daniel loosened his tie with one irritated movement before sitting down again beside Vanessa. Neither of them looked at me anymore. It was strange how quickly cruelty became easier once people convinced themselves you no longer mattered. Harold finally opened the envelope with slow, careful hands, but before removing the papers inside, he looked directly at me. "Margaret," he said quietly, "your husband asked that I confirm something first. Did Edward ever give you a key?" I frowned slightly. "A key?" "Yes. Something small. Possibly hidden." Daniel rolled his eyes immediately. "What is this supposed to be? Some dramatic scavenger hunt?" Harold ignored him completely. I searched my memory while rainwater slid down the office windows in silver streams. Then suddenly, I remembered the old watch. Edward's watch. My fingers tightened around the silver timepiece still resting beside me on the table. 3 nights before the funeral, I had been unable to sleep. The house felt too large after midnight. Every hallway carried echoes of memories I could not escape. I remember walking downstairs wearing Edward's old navy cardigan wrapped tightly around my shoulders because the heating system never reached the breakfast room properly in late fall. The grandfather clock near the staircase had just struck 1 in the morning when I noticed the light under the door of Edward's study. For a moment, grief played tricks on me, and I almost believed he was still inside reading financial reports the way he used to. But of course the room was empty when I opened the door. The leather chair sat motionless behind the desk. His glasses were still folded neatly beside a stack of unopened sympathy cards. The air smelled faintly of cedarwood and coffee. I stood there quietly, running my hand along the bookshelf he built himself nearly 20 years earlier. Edward loved building things with his hands. Furniture, cabinets. Even the greenhouse behind the pool had been his project after retirement. He said working with what helped him think clearly. That night, I noticed his watch sitting alone on the desk beside an old framed photograph from our trip to Cape Cod years ago. Daniel was 14 in that picture. He stood between us smiling with sunburned cheeks while holding a fishing rod almost taller than he was. Back then, he still reached for my hand crossing parking lots. Back then, Vanessa did not exist. I picked up the watch slowly and almost put it back down before noticing the unusual weight in it. Edward had carried that watch every day for decades. I knew exactly how it should feel in my hand. My heart began beating faster as I turned it over carefully. There was a tiny latch near the back edge I had never noticed before. Inside was a small brass key wrapped tightly in folded paper. My breath caught immediately. Written across the paper in Edward's careful handwriting were 6 words. "If things change, trust Harold Bennett." I remember standing alone in that dark, silent study while the clock downstairs continued ticking steadily through the house. I did not understand what Edward meant then, but for the first time since his death, I felt something unfamiliar move beneath the grief. Unease. The kind that settles deep in your stomach before a storm arrives. Back at the conference table, Harold nodded slowly after I finished speaking. "Do you still have the key?" he asked quietly. I looked down at my purse resting beside my chair. Then Daniel leaned forward suddenly, his expression sharp with suspicion. What exactly did my father hide from us? Harold's face remained perfectly calm. "That," he replied softly, "is what your father expected you to ask." Daniel stared at me as if the answer to his entire future might already be sitting inside my purse. Vanessa slowly placed a hand over his wrist beneath the table, a gesture so subtle most people would have missed it. But I had spent 15 years watching her manage emotions without ever appearing controlling. That was her talent. She never pushed openly. She guided quietly until people believed the ideas were their own. Harold folded his hands together and leaned back slightly in his chair. "Edward instructed me to wait until the reading of the will before discussing the contents of the safety deposit box," he said. "The key Margaret found belongs to that box." Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh. "This is unbelievable." "No," Harold replied calmly. "What is unbelievable is how accurately your father predicted this moment." The room fell silent again. My husband's cousin Elaine shifted uncomfortably near the far end of the table while avoiding eye contact with everyone. Outside, the rain had slowed to a light drizzle, but the clouds hanging over Hartford still darkened the windows like approaching evening, even though it was barely past noon. I reached into my purse slowly and pulled out the small brass key wrapped carefully in Edward's note. Daniel's eyes locked onto it immediately. "What is in the box?" he demanded. I looked down at the key resting in my palm. "I do not know." That was the truth. But deep down, I had started suspecting Edward knew something long before his heart failed in the middle of that cold October morning. The signs had been there. I simply chose not to see them at the time. About 6 months before Edward died, he began spending more evenings alone in his study after dinner. At first I assumed it was grief over retirement settling heavily on him. Edward had spent nearly 40 years building Whitmore Financial Group from a 2-room office into one of the most respected investment firms in Connecticut. Stepping away from work had left an emptiness he struggled to admit. But now, looking back, I realized something else had changed too. He had started watching Daniel differently. Quietly. Carefully. One evening last spring, I remember bringing tea into the living room after dinner while Daniel and Vanessa sat discussing renovation plans for the house. Vanessa had spread expensive kitchen designs across the coffee table while speaking excitedly about expanding the upstairs master suite. "Open concepts are much better for resale value," she said brightly, "especially in neighborhoods like this." Edward looked up slowly from his armchair beside the fireplace. "Resale," he repeated. Vanessa smiled immediately. "Oh, not now, of course. I just mean eventually." Daniel laughed awkwardly. Vanessa watches too many home renovation shows. But Edward did not laugh. He simply stared at the architectural drawings for a long moment before folding his newspaper carefully. "Interesting," he said quietly. Later that night, while I loaded dishes into the dishwasher, Edward stood beside the kitchen window watching rain collect along the backyard patio stones. "Do you ever get the feeling people are waiting for something?" he asked suddenly. I dried my hands slowly. "What do you mean?" "Nothing." He gave a faint, tired smile. "Maybe I am becoming suspicious in my old age." I walked over and touched his arm gently. "Daniel loves you." "Yes," Edward replied softly. "I believe he does." Then after a long pause, he added words that returned to me now with frightening clarity. "I am simply no longer certain what influences him more." Back in the attorney's office, Harold reached for another document inside the envelope while Daniel's jaw tightened visibly. Vanessa remained very still beside him now. Too still, like someone carefully controlling panic before it reached the surface. Harold adjusted his glasses once more before speaking. "Your father left instructions regarding the safety deposit box," he said quietly. "And according to those instructions, all 4 of us will be visiting the bank today." The drive to the bank felt longer than it actually was. Hartford traffic crawled through wet streets while gray clouds hung low above the city skyline. Harold drove separately in his dark Lincoln sedan while Daniel insisted Vanessa and I ride with him. The silence inside the car stretched so tightly it almost vibrated. Vanessa spent most of the drive scrolling through her phone without speaking, although every few minutes I caught her glancing toward me through the reflection in the passenger window. Daniel kept both hands locked on the steering wheel, his jaw tense enough to sharpen the lines in his face. The little brass key rested inside my coat pocket like a secret heartbeat. I stared out at familiar streets blurred by rainwater and thought about how strange grief was. 1 month earlier, Edward and I had driven through these same roads discussing Thanksgiving plans for the family. Now I was riding beside a son who looked at me like an obstacle standing between him and something he believed already belonged to him. When we finally arrived at First Hartford Trust Bank, the marble steps outside glistened with rain. Harold was already waiting beneath the awning near the entrance, holding a leather folder beneath one arm. The moment Daniel parked the car, he stepped out quickly. "Let us just get this over with," he muttered. Inside, the bank smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee. The manager greeted Harold immediately, clearly recognizing him, and escorted us downstairs toward the private vault area. The hallway leading there felt colder than the rest of the building. Fluorescent lights reflected softly against steel doors lining both walls. I remember hearing the click of Vanessa's heels echoing behind us while the bank manager explained procedures in a low professional voice. Edward always handled these matters alone. I had never even known he maintained a safety deposit box here. The manager stopped at one of the larger vault drawers and turned toward me politely. "Mrs. Whitmore, I will need your key." My fingers trembled slightly as I handed over the brass key from my pocket. Daniel noticed immediately. "Mom," he said suddenly, his tone softer for the first time all day, "whatever Dad left in there, we can figure it out together." The sudden warmth in his voice felt more painful than the anger had. I looked at him quietly without answering. Harold inserted a second master key beside mine. The heavy lock released with a deep metallic click. Then the drawer slowly slid open. Inside sat 3 thick envelopes, a small velvet box, and a digital recorder. Nobody moved at first. Even Vanessa stopped pretending calm. Her eyes fixed immediately on the envelopes labeled in Edward's handwriting. One carried my name. One carried Daniel's. The third simply read, "To be opened if necessary." Harold carefully lifted the recorder first. "Edward instructed me to play this only if there were disputes regarding Margaret's inheritance." Daniel crossed his arms. "Then play it." Harold pressed the button. Static crackled softly for a second before Edward's familiar voice filled the cold vault room. Hearing him again after weeks of silence nearly stopped my breath. "If you are listening to this," Edward said calmly, "then events unfolded exactly as I feared they might." Daniel's face changed immediately. Vanessa looked down at the floor. Edward continued speaking slowly, each word measured with painful clarity. "Margaret spent 43 years protecting this family. If anyone sitting in this room has treated her with disrespect, manipulation, or cruelty after my death, then they have misunderstood me entirely." The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead while nobody spoke. I felt tears sting my eyes for the first time since the funeral, but I kept my face still. Edward's voice remained steady through the recorder. "I built my estate carefully, not to reward greed, to reveal it." Then the recording stopped. The vault room stayed silent long after Edward's voice disappeared from the recorder. I could hear nothing except the faint electrical hum from the fluorescent lights overhead and the distant sound of footsteps somewhere upstairs in the bank lobby. Daniel stared at the recorder as if hearing his father speak had unsettled something deeper than anger. Vanessa recovered first. She always did. She folded her arms slowly and forced a small, controlled smile toward Harold. "Surely this does not change the legal structure of the estate," she said carefully. Harold looked at her over the rim of his glasses. "Actually," he replied, "that depends entirely on behavior." Daniel turned sharply. "What does that mean?" Harold opened the envelope marked with my name and removed several pages clipped neatly together. "Edward created a family trust nearly a year ago," he explained. "The majority of his assets were transferred before his death." Daniel's expression hardened immediately. "Transferred to who?" Harold did not answer right away. Instead, he handed the documents directly to me. My hands trembled slightly as I looked down at Edward's signature near the bottom of the first page. The legal language blurred for a moment before my eyes adjusted. Then I saw it clearly. Primary trustee, Margaret Whitmore. Daniel stepped closer instantly. Let me see that. Harold blocked him with one calm movement of his hand. You will receive your copy shortly. Vanessa's polished composure cracked for the first time. Only slightly, but enough. Edward never mentioned any trust, she said. That is because he intentionally kept it private, Harold replied. I lowered myself slowly onto the small leather chair near the vault table while my pulse echoed heavily in my ears. Edward had done all of this quietly, carefully, without ever telling me. Suddenly memories began rearranging themselves in my mind, like puzzle pieces finally sliding into place. The extra meetings with Harold during the summer. The evenings Edward spent reviewing documents alone in his study. The way he occasionally watched Daniel and Vanessa during family dinners with a distant, thoughtful expression I never understood at the time. He had not been distracted. He had been preparing. Harold removed another document from the envelope and continued speaking in the same measured tone. The trust includes what is known as a conduct clause. If Margaret Whitmore experienced coercion, intimidation, forced displacement from her residence, or documented emotional mistreatment following Edward's death, certain distributions would automatically change. Daniel stared at him in disbelief. That is insane. No, Harold answered quietly. It is thorough. Vanessa stepped forward then, her voice suddenly softer. Margaret, surely you know we would never mistreat you. I looked at her for a long moment. Her expression appeared concerned now, sympathetic even. But I remembered the realtor brochures she left open across my kitchen counter. I remembered hearing her say, once the house is ours, she is gone. I remembered the way she referred to me as one person instead of family. And suddenly I felt something inside me grow still. Not angry, not triumphant, simply clear. You already did, I said softly. The silence after those words felt colder than the vault itself. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face before pacing once across the narrow room. Dad would never cut me out over misunderstandings. Harold reached for the final envelope resting inside the box. Edward did not remove you entirely, he said carefully. But he did leave specific instructions regarding accountability. Daniel stopped moving. Vanessa's eyes locked onto the final envelope. What instructions? She asked quietly. Harold looked at both of them for several long seconds before answering. Your father documented concerns about financial pressure being placed on Margaret after his death. Daniel's face drained of color slightly. Then Harold added one final sentence that changed the entire room. And according to Edward's notes, he began documenting those concerns nearly 8 months before he died. Daniel looked like he wanted to argue, but no words came out immediately. He simply stood there in the cold vault room, staring at Harold while the reality of his father's planning slowly settled over him. Vanessa recovered faster. She always understood that silence could be dangerous if left uncontrolled too long. This is becoming unnecessarily dramatic, she said carefully, smoothing the sleeve of her coat again. Edward was grieving his health problems during those last months. People become emotional when they fear the end of their lives. Harold's expression hardened slightly for the first time all afternoon. Edward was not emotional, he replied. He was observant. Vanessa opened her mouth to answer, but Harold continued before she could interrupt. Your father documented conversations, financial requests, proposed property transfers, and repeated pressure placed upon Margaret following his diagnosis. Daniel blinked hard. Pressure, he repeated. What pressure? Harold looked directly at him. The pressure to transfer ownership of the Whitmore residence before Edward's death. The room seemed to narrow around us. I watched Daniel's face carefully, then, because something shifted in it. Not innocence. Recognition. Like someone suddenly realizing private conversations were never as hidden as they believed. 8 months earlier, shortly after Edward's cardiologist warned us his condition was worsening, Daniel began visiting more frequently. At first I found comfort in it. He brought groceries sometimes. Fixed the patio gate one weekend. Sat beside his father during football games on Sunday afternoons. I remember feeling grateful our family seemed closer again during such a frightening time. But slowly the visits changed. One evening in July, I walked into the kitchen and found Vanessa standing beside Edward while he reviewed paperwork at the island counter. This would simplify probate later, she said brightly while sliding documents toward him. Edward did not touch them. What documents are those? I asked. Vanessa smiled immediately. Just estate planning suggestions. Nothing urgent. Edward folded the papers quietly without answering. Later that night, after Daniel and Vanessa left, I found him sitting alone on the back patio watching lightning bugs drift across the lawn. The summer air smelled faintly of chlorine from the pool and fresh-cut grass from the country club nearby. I sat beside him without speaking for a while. Edward finally sighed. "Have you noticed how interested they suddenly are in logistics?" he asked quietly. I remember laughing softly because I did not understand what troubled him. Daniel is trying to help. Edward nodded slowly, but he never looked convinced. "Perhaps," he said. Then after a long silence, he added something I never forgot. "Real help does not usually arrive carrying paperwork." Back inside the vault room, Harold opened the final envelope at last. The thick paper crackled loudly in the silence. Daniel watched every movement now with visible tension, while Vanessa remained unnaturally still beside him. Harold removed several typed pages and one sealed handwritten letter. According to Edward's instructions, he said carefully, "The contents of this envelope were only to be revealed if conflict arose regarding Margaret's position in the estate." Daniel dragged a hand through his hair. "Fine. Then reveal it." Harold adjusted his glasses and scanned the first page briefly before looking up again. Edward established permanent residency rights for Margaret within the Whitmore home for the remainder of her life. Vanessa's face changed instantly. "Just for a second. But enough." Harold continued calmly. "The property itself was transferred into the trust months before Edward's death. It cannot be sold, leveraged, or transferred without Margaret's direct approval." Daniel stared at him in disbelief. That house was supposed to stay in the family. I looked at my son quietly across the cold vault room. "It already is," I said softly. Then Harold unfolded the handwritten letter. "There is one final instruction from your father," he said, and he requested that I read it aloud personally. Harold unfolded the handwritten letter with slow, deliberate care, and suddenly the vault room felt smaller than before. Even the air seemed thinner. Daniel stood rigid beside the metal table, while Vanessa watched Harold with the calm expression people wear when they are trying very hard not to appear nervous. I sat quietly in the leather chair with Edward's silver watch resting cold in my hand. Seeing his handwriting again made my chest ache in ways grief still could not fully explain. Harold cleared his throat softly before beginning to read. "To my family," he said, his voice steady against the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. "If this letter is being read aloud, then the protections I placed around Margaret were necessary." Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. Harold continued, "I spent most of my life building things. A company, a home, a family. I always believed character revealed itself quietly over time. Unfortunately, so does greed." Vanessa shifted beside Daniel at those words, but she said nothing. Harold kept reading. "Margaret gave this family more love, patience, and loyalty than anyone sitting in this room will ever fully understand. If she is being treated as inconvenient after my death, then some of you have failed far more deeply than financially." The silence inside the vault became almost unbearable. I could hear my own breathing now. Slow, uneven. Daniel stared at the floor while tension pulled across his face like wire. For a brief moment, I saw something there I had not seen in weeks. Shame. Real shame. But it disappeared quickly. "Dad is making assumptions based on misunderstandings," Daniel muttered. Harold looked up sharply. "Your father rarely misunderstood people." Then he returned to the letter. "Daniel, if you are hearing this, I need you to understand something clearly. Wealth is not character. Entitlement is not love. And allowing someone to isolate you from your own mother is not strength." Vanessa's head lifted immediately. "Excuse me," she said coldly. But Harold continued reading without acknowledging her interruption. "I noticed the conversations about transferring the house before my death. I noticed the pressure placed on Margaret while she was caring for me during my illness. I noticed how often kindness toward her became conditional once legal matters entered the room. My throat tightened painfully because I remembered those moments now with terrifying clarity. The whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the kitchen. The realtor business cards left near the mail. Vanessa casually referring to future renovations before Edward had even finished chemotherapy treatments. At the time, I convinced myself grief was making me overly sensitive. But Edward had seen it too. And unlike me, he trusted what he saw. Harold lowered the letter briefly before speaking in his own voice. "The trust conditions are now fully activated." Daniel looked up sharply. "What does that mean exactly?" Harold placed the letter carefully onto the vault table beside the recorder. It means the majority of Edward's personal assets remain under Margaret's sole control during her lifetime. It also means all discretionary distributions to secondary beneficiaries require trustee approval. Vanessa's face lost color for the first time. Secondary beneficiaries? She repeated quietly. Harold met her eyes calmly. You and Daniel. Daniel took a step back like the words physically struck him. That is impossible. Harold slid several pages across the table toward him. No, he said softly. It is legal. Nobody moved after that. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead while rain tapped softly against the small basement windows near the ceiling. I looked down at Edward's watch in my hand and suddenly remembered something he told me during our first year of marriage. We had been young then, eating takeout Chinese food on the floor of our first apartment because we could not yet afford furniture. Edward smiled at me and said, "The most valuable thing you can build is a peaceful home." Standing there inside that cold vault, I realized something heartbreaking. Edward had spent his final months protecting the peace we built together from the people meant to continue it. Nobody spoke while we gathered the documents from the vault table. Daniel looked exhausted suddenly, older than he had that morning inside Harold's office. Vanessa remained composed on the surface, but I noticed the stiffness in her movements now. The careful control she always carried had begun to crack around the edges. Harold placed the envelopes back into his leather folder before turning toward me gently. "Margaret," he said, "there is one more item your husband requested I give you privately." He handed me the small velvet box that had remained untouched beside the recorder the entire time. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside rested a delicate gold key attached to a silver tag engraved with only 2 words. Lake House. I stared down at it in confusion while Harold gave a faint knowing smile. Edward purchased the property last spring under the trust, he explained quietly. He wanted you to have somewhere peaceful if the family home ever became emotionally difficult. Daniel lifted his head immediately. There is another property? Harold nodded once. A lake house in northern Vermont. Fully paid for. Margaret is the sole owner. Vanessa looked away first. That small movement told me more than words could have. The drive back home happened in silence again, but this time the quiet felt different. Heavier for them. Clearer for me. Rain still covered the streets of Hartford in silver reflections, while bare trees bent softly in the November wind. I sat in the back seat holding the small gold key in my palm and watched familiar neighborhoods pass by outside the window. When we finally pulled into the long driveway of the Whitmore house, dusk had already settled across the property. Warm porch lights glowed against the wet stone walkway Edward designed himself years ago. For a moment, none of us moved. Then Daniel turned off the engine. "Mom," he said quietly without looking at me. "I never wanted things to become like this." I studied the side of his face carefully. He sounded sincere now, or perhaps simply frightened by consequences he never believed would arrive. "Things become what people allow them to become," I answered softly. Vanessa reached for the door handle immediately after that. She disappeared into the house without another word. Daniel remained seated for a few seconds longer before finally turning toward me. His eyes looked tired in a way I had never seen before. "Dad really thought I would hurt you?" he asked. The question lingered painfully between us. I looked past him toward the glowing kitchen windows where I once spent decades cooking family dinners while Edward sat nearby reading newspapers aloud to me. Thanksgiving turkey. Christmas cinnamon rolls. Birthday cakes with too much frosting because Daniel loved them that way as a little boy. Entire lifetimes lived quietly inside those walls. "Your father thought I deserved peace," I said at last. Daniel lowered his eyes. Neither of us spoke again after that. Later that night, long after the house had gone silent, I walked alone through Edward's study carrying a cup of tea I no longer wanted to drink. The room smelled exactly the same as it always had. Cedarwood. Coffee. Old paper. I sat slowly in his leather chair and opened the drawer where he kept personal letters. Near the back, beneath tax files and receipts, I found one final envelope with my name written across the front in blue ink. Inside was a single handwritten note. "Margaret, if you are reading this, then I was right to worry. But I hope you remember something important. You were never the burden in this family. You were the reason it existed at all." I read the words 3 times before quietly folding the letter against my chest. Outside the study windows, Rain continued falling softly across the dark, empty lawn. For the first time since Edward died, the silence inside the house no longer felt lonely. It felt honest.